Welcome to my channel.
Chowed around the small police station in Lochdubh like a banshee with a stubbed toe. It was Hogmanay, the last day of the year, a time when the rest of Scotland was preparing for drink, song, and ill-advised declarations of love or violence. PC Hamish Macbeth, however, was preparing to do absolutely nothing. Inside the kitchen, the coal stove was glowing fiercely, giving off a heat that made the air thick and cozy. Hamish sat slumped in his armchair, his long legs stretched out toward the warmth, nursing a mug of coffee strong enough to strip paint. His small, patchy-haired dog, Lugs, was a curled lump of contented snoring by his feet. The telephone on the office desk rang. It was a shrill, demanding sound that spoke of bureaucracy, schedules, and very likely Detective Chief Inspector Blair, shouting from the climate-controlled safety of Strathclyde headquarters. Hamish eyed the phone suspiciously over the rim of his mug. He took a slow slurp of coffee. The phone continued to ring. "It could be important," Hamish said aloud to the dog. Lugs let out a small, squeaking fart and didn't stir. "Aye, you're right," Hamish agreed. "If it's important, they'll ring back. If it's just Blair wanting to know if I've gritted the road outside the pub, he can wait." Hamish hated Hogmanay. In Lochdubh, it meant that perfectly sensible fishermen and crofters, who spent the rest of the year muttering into their beards, would suddenly decide they were heavily armed poets. It was a night of forced joviality that inevitably ended in a fistfight outside the Lochdubh Hotel, over whose grandfather had stolen whose sheep in 1952. His strategy was simple: stay warm, stay hidden, and only emerge if there was actual blood or fire. She was just contemplating the possibility of sneaking a drop of whiskey into his coffee when the sound of a powerful engine cut through the howling wind. It wasn't the rattle of a local Land Rover or the chug of a fishing boat engine. This was a deep, expensive throbbing sound. Hamish sighed, a long, mournful sound that rivaled the wind. The peace was already shattering. He hauled himself up, put on his greatcoat, jammed his peaked cap onto his fiery red hair, and went outside. The cold hit his face like a wet slate. Parked directly in front of the Lochdubh Hotel, taking up 3 spaces and looking entirely obscene against the backdrop of the grey, towering mountains, was a gleaming silver Bentley Bentayga. It was spotless. It looked less like a car and more like a spaceship that had made an emergency landing in the wrong century. As Hamish watched, the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, fleshy, and dressed in brand-new tweed that was far too loud and far too green for the Highlands. He looked like a man who had once seen a picture of a Scottish laird in a magazine and decided to buy the costume. This was Marcus Sterling. The village grapevine, which was faster than fibre optics and twice as unreliable, had been buzzing for weeks. Sterling was a London property developer with teeth too white for nature and a wallet too fat for comfort. He had recently purchased the derelict Craigie Manor on the hill, overlooking the loch, with vague, threatening plans to turn it into an exclusive Highland wellness retreat. Sterling stood by his expensive car, looking at the quaint harbour of Lochdubh, as if he were deciding where to install the gift shop. Hamish ambled over, adopting his best slow-witted village copper slouch. "Grand car ye have there, sir," Hamish said, his voice soft and lighting. "Though a wee bit wide for the cattle grids, I'd imagine." Sterling turned, looking Hamish up and down with the dismissive air of someone examining a piece of interesting fungus. "It handles fine, Constable. It's all about knowing how to drive." His voice was loud, braying, the kind of voice used to ordering magnums of champagne in Mayfair clubs. "You're Macbeth, I assume." The local presence. "Aye, that's me. Just making sure you found the place all right. The roads can be tricky." "The roads are atrocious," Sterling barked, slamming the car door. "I nearly took the sump off 3 miles back. You people really need to invest in some tarmac." Still, he waved a gloved hand dismissively at the stunning vista of Loch and Mountain. "The view is marketable. Very marketable." He didn't wait for a reply, but strode toward the hotel entrance, nearly knocking over Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, who was exiting with a bag of scones. Sterling didn't apologize, he merely stepped around her, as if she were a misplaced bollard. Mrs. Wellington bristled, her floral scarf twitching with indignation. She looked at Hamish. "Well," she huffed, "someone certainly thinks highly of themselves." "Aye," Hamish said, watching the hotel door swing shut behind the Londoner. "A man who thinks the mountains are just there to be marketed is a man who's going to find the Highlands a very unforgiving place." He felt a familiar sinking sensation in his stomach. It wasn't hunger just eaten half a loaf of bread with butter. It was the premonition of paperwork. Men like Sterling didn't just arrive in Lochdubh, they landed like unexploded bombs. Hamish turned up his collar against the biting sleet. She needed to go to the hotel, just to show the face and gauge the level of animosity brewing in the bar. He suspected it would be high. The bar of the Lochdubh Hotel was a thick soup of tobacco smoked, despite the laws and the pungent scent of wet wool. Archie McLean was behind the bar, looking as if he had been carved out of a particularly grim piece of oak. At the far end, Marcus Sterling had already established a perimeter of expensive whiskey bottles and was lecturing the local poachers on the proper way to market Scottish salmon to the London elite. "It's about the narrative, you see," Sterling brayed, his voice cutting through the soft Gaelic murmurs like a chainsaw. "People don't want fish, they want a story. They want to feel the struggle of the river in every bite. Most folk just want it with a bit of lemon and some chips," Archie muttered, though not loud enough for Sterling to hear. He caught Hamish's eye and slid a modest dram across the counter before Hamish had even reached the stool. Hamish settled in, Lugs taking up his usual position under the brass footrail. The constable watched Sterling. The man was a walking invitation to homicide. He was currently showing a bored-looking girl from the village young Morag, who worked the laundry, the features on his gold watch, oblivious to the fact that her brother, a man with fists the size of hams, was watching from the shadows of the dartboard. The evening wore on with the slow, inevitable weight of a Highland winter. The bells rang out at midnight with a half-hearted cheer and a rendition of Auld Lang Syne that sounded more like a collective groan than a celebration. Hamish managed to slip away by 1 a.m, successfully avoiding a first footing invitation from the Curry sisters, which would have involved 3 hours of accordion music and a very dry fruitcake. He had just fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind earned by a man who had successfully evaded all social responsibilities, when the hammering began. It wasn't the wind this time. It was a frantic, rhythmic pounding on the station door. "Hamish! Hamish Macbeth, wake up, man! There's a horror at the well." Hamish groaned, pulling the duvet over his head. "Go away, Archie. If it's a horror, call the minister. It's the Londoner." Archie's voice was high and thin with genuine shock. He's in the wellness spring, and he's not looking very well at all." Hamish sighed, his feet finding the cold floorboards. The premonition of paperwork had become a reality. He dressed slowly, fumbling with his buttons, his red hair standing up in ginger tufts. He didn't bother with a razor. A murderer, even a very messy accident, didn't require a clean shave. He followed Archie up the winding, frost-slicked path toward Craigie Manor, Lugs trotting along with a puzzled expression. The wellness spring was a small, ancient pool that Sterling had recently cleared of weeds and surrounded with expensive, jagged marble tiles. There, floating face down in the icy water, was Marcus Sterling. He was still wearing his loud green tweeds, which had ballooned up around him like a giant, mossy bubble. But it was the accessory that made the scene truly bizarre. Tightly wedged around Sterling's neck was a traditional Highland targia heavy, circular wooden shield studded with brachestat. He had taken from the hotel wall for ambience earlier that evening. It looked as though he had tried to wear the shield as an oversized, lethal collar. "Och, man," Hamish whispered, crouching by the edge of the pool. He didn't touch the body yet. He looked at the way the silver Bentley sat, idling in the driveway nearby, its light still cutting through the morning mist, a silent witness to the absurdity. "Is he dead, Hamish?" Archie asked, hovering 10 feet back, his face the color of old parchment. "Unless he's developed the ability to breathe through a Victorian shield underwater, I'd say he's very dead indeed," Hamish said. He stood up, his knees cracking in the silence. He looked at the surrounding mud, the strange scuff marks on the marble, and the deliberate, almost artistic way the shield had been positioned. It wasn't just a death, it was a statement. And as the first grey light of the new year filtered through the clouds, Hamish realized with a sinking heart that his lazy routine was officially over. Worse than that, the discovery of the body meant the inevitable arrival of the one thing he feared more than actual work. DC-5's Blair. "Go back to the hotel, Archie," Hamish said, reaching for his notebook with a reluctant hand, "and tell your wife to put a very large pot of coffee on. It's going to be a long year." The silence of the Highland morning didn't last long. Within 2 hours, the narrow, winding track to Craigie Manor was choked with the white and blue liveried vehicles of the Strathclyde police. The screech of tires and the aggressive slam of car doors echoed off the surrounding hills, announcing the arrival of the real police. Detective Chief Inspector Blair erupted from the lead car like a small, angry volcano. His face was already a shade of purple that suggested a dangerously high blood pressure, fueled no doubt by a combination of a New Year's Eve hangover and the indignity of having to work on a public holiday. He marched toward the wellness spring, his heavy shoes crunching over the frost-covered grass, followed by his two shadows, Detectives Anderson and Macnab, who looked like they would rather be anywhere else on Earth. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing across the loch. "What in the name of God have you done now? I leave you alone for 5 minutes and you've managed to get a millionaire drowned in a bird bath." Hamish, who was leaning against a stone pillar and looking quite as if he were waiting for a bus that might never arrive, tipped his cap. "Good morning to you, sir, and a happy new year. I haven't done much of anything, except keep the crows away from the remains." Blair stomped to the edge of the pool, peered down at the bloated green tweed and the brass-studded shield, and let out a sound that was half snort, half whine. "A shield?" "He's wearing a shield. What is this, Macbeth? Some kind of local druid ritual? Did you people decide to sacrifice the Sassenach to ensure a good herring catch?" "I don't think the herring care much for property developers, sir," Hamish said mildly. "But it is a bit unusual, I'll grant you that." "Unusual? It's a circus." Blair turned on his heel, his eyes narrowed and predatory. He ignored the forensic team that was beginning to set up their tapes. It's obvious what happened here. Some local lout, probably one of those poachers you're so fond of protecting, decided to teach the city man a lesson. They got into a struggle. The local grabbed a bit of heritage off a wall and shoved his head in. It's a common assault gone wrong. I want a list of everyone who was in that bar last night. I want names, addresses, and blood types. Archie McLean was there, Hamish offered, his tone helpful and vacant, and young Morag, and her brother Fergus. "He's got a bit of a temper, has Fergus, but he's mostly just fond of his sister." "Fergus, eh?" Blair pounced on the name like a terrier on a rat. "A big lad? Strong enough to jam a man into a wooden collar?" "Oh, Fergus could bend a horseshoe with his teeth if he had the mind to," Hamish said, watching Lugg sniff suspiciously at Blair's polished shoes. "But he was mostly busy losing at darts last night. He's not much for the water." "I'll decide who's for the water, Macbeth," Blair snapped. "Anderson! Macnab! Get down to that hotel, find this Fergus. If he's got a scratch on him, bring him in. And you," he jabbed a thick finger into Hamish's chest, "stay out of the way. I don't want you contaminating my crime scene with your Highland intuition, or whatever you call your laziness these days. Go and direct traffic, go and find a cat in a tree. Just stay out of my sight." Hamish nodded obediently, his expression one of deep relief. "If you say so, sir. I'll just go and see if the hotel has any more of that coffee. It's a terrible thing. A murder, on a cold morning, drains the spirit, so it does." He turned and began to amble back down the path, his hands deep in his pockets. To any observer, he looked like a man who had been thoroughly put in his place. A simple village bobby happy to let the big men from the city take the burden. But as he walked, Hamish wasn't thinking about traffic or cats. He was thinking about the Bentley. He was thinking about how Marcus Sterling had been so proud of his driving. Yet his car was idling in the driveway while he was drowned in a pool 50 yards away. He was also thinking about the shield. A man doesn't just fall into a pool and accidentally put on a piece of 17th century armor. It takes time to fit a targe around a neck. It takes a certain kind of dark Scottish irony. He needed to talk to someone who knew the gossip better than the police knew the law. He needed to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe. If anyone knew what skeletons were rattling in Marcus Sterling's expensive closets, it would be the lady of the manor. The walk back toward the village gave Hamish the time he needed to think, though thinking was a heavy burden he usually tried to avoid on a holiday. Luggs trotted ahead, his tail an optimistic flag against the dour Highland morning. Hamish didn't head straight for the station instead. He detoured toward the back door of the Lochdubh Hotel. In his experience, the kitchen was where the real intelligence was gathered, far from the posturing and performance in the bar. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of frying bacon and the sharp, medicinal tang of floor wax. Jessie McLean, Archie's formidable wife, was scrubbing a heavy iron pot with a vigor that suggested she was imagining it was someone else's head. "Och, Hamish," she said, not looking up. "I heard. Found him in the well, did you? And him dressed up like a common extra in a Bonnie Prince Charlie film." "He was a bit overdressed for a bath, aye," Hamish said, sliding into a chair by the warmth of the range. He adopted his most vacant expression, the one that usually prompted people to fill the silence with things they shouldn't say. "Blair's up there now, shouting at the grass. She seems to think Fergus had a hand in it." Jessie stopped scrubbing and looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Fergus is a fool, but he's our fool. He wouldn't waste a good target on a man like Sterling." "Do you know what that man was doing, Hamish?" "He was in here yesterday afternoon, demanding to see the deeds for the old smithy. Said his wellness retreat, needed a clear line of sight to the water, and the smithy was in the way. The smithy? Hamish asked, his ears pricking up. But that's been in the Patterson family since the clearances. Not according to Mr. High and Mighty Sterling. He claimed there was a flaw in the title, said he had them out by February. Mrs. Patterson was in tears in the post office, and he didn't stop there. He was poking around the old ruins at the head of the loch, talking about reclaiming the land for the true owners. Hamish took a slow sip of the tea Jessie had placed in front of him. This was the dirty secret Blair would never find. To Blair, a property developer was just a man with a checkbook. To the people of Lochdubh, a man who threatened the land was an invader. He wasn't alone when he arrived, was he? Hamish asked softly. He was not, Jessie spat. He had a woman with him. A sleek thing in a coat that cost more than my house. Gloria, he called her. She looked at this kitchen like it was a museum for the underprivileged. They had a row in the corner of the something about a signature and a final payment. She left in a huff and took a taxi all the way to the hotel in Drim. Didn't even stay for the bells. Hamish nodded, his mind whirring beneath his calm exterior. A developer with no money, a woman looking for a payout, and a village full of people whose homes had been threatened. The motive wasn't just petty, it was ancestral. He finished his tea and stood up, feeling the weight of the investigation shifting. He needed to verify the true owners Sterling had mentioned, and there was only one person in the district who had the breeding and the library to understand the tangled web of Highland inheritance. He left the hotel and began the long, winding walk toward Tommel Castle. The mist was beginning to lift, revealing the jagged peaks of the mountains, cold and indifferent to the small, murderous dramas of men. As he approached the great iron gates, he saw a familiar figure standing by the stone pillars, her blonde hair caught in the wind. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe looked as elegant as ever, though there was a tension in her posture that told Hamish she had already heard the news. In Lochdubh, bad news didn't just travel, it arrived before it had even happened. Hamish Macbeth stood at the gates of Tommel Castle, the wind tugging at his red hair, with a persistence that mirrored his own mounting unease. The gravel of the long, winding drive crunched beneath his boots, a sound that felt far too loud in the heavy, expectant silence of the morning. Lugs followed closely at his heels, his ears flattened against the biting Highland air, looking every bit as reluctant as his master. To anyone watching from the narrow windows of the castle, Hamish looked like a man delivering a bill he knew could not be paid, weary, slightly dishevelled, and entirely out of place among the ancestral stone and manicured hedges. But behind his hazel eyes, the gears of a very different machine were turning. He wasn't thinking about bills. He was thinking about the way Marcus Sterling had looked in that pool, and how the wealthy of Lochdubh always seemed to have a way of making life complicated for the poor. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe was waiting for him near the great stone entrance, her barber jacket perfectly fitted and her blonde hair defying the damp mist. She looked like a painting of a Highland aristocrat, a vision that always caused a painful tug in Hamish's chest. He loved her with the quiet, desperate patience of a man who knew he was chasing a ghost. Priscilla wanted a man with ambition, a man who would wear a sharp suit and command a precinct in a city where the air didn't smell of peat and salt. Hamish, however, only wanted to be left alone to poach a salmon and keep the peace in a village that usually didn't want it kept. This fundamental gap between them was a chasm they both crossed occasionally, but never quite managed to close. As he approached, she offered a small, strained smile that didn't reach her eyes, which were clouded with the kind of worry that only the truly well-to-do can afford over a scandal. "A dreadful way to start the new year, Hamish," she said, her voice clear and cool as a mountain stream. "The whole village is talking. My father is in a towering rage. He says that having a murder so close to the estate is bad for the property values, as if the poor man's death was a personal insult to the Halberton-Smythe lineage. Well, your father always did have a keen eye for the bottom line," Hamish replied, his voice soft and lighting. He leaned against a stone pillar, adopting his most harmless, slow-witted stance. "But a dead man in a targe is a bit more than a blow to the property values. Priscilla, it's a message. G.I. was wondering if you might have heard anything about our Mr. Sterling. He seemed to have a knack for rubbing folk the wrong way, and I suspect he didn't stop at the village borders." Priscilla sighed, looking out toward the loch where the mist was beginning to coil like smoke. "He was a charlatan, Hamish. He came to dinner here 3 nights ago, boasting about his wellness retreat and his connections in the city. But it was all a facade. He spent the entire evening trying to corner my father into a partnership, claiming he had found a legal loophole regarding the old land grants. He mentioned something about the true owners of the smithy and the ruins. He wasn't just planning a hotel, he was planning a seizure. He was desperate, Hamish. I saw him in the hallway on his phone, arguing with someone about a bridge loan that hadn't come through. He wasn't a millionaire. He was a man about to drown in his own debts, long before he ever hit that water. Hamish nodded slowly, his mind filing away the information. Desperation was a far more common motive for murder than greed ever was. A greedy man takes what he wants, a desperate man does whatever he must to survive. And what about the woman? Gloria, Jessie McLean said. She left in a huff before the bells. Gloria Sterling, Priscilla said, her lip curling slightly in distaste. She's his ex-wife, though they still traveled together for what they called business optics. She was the one with the real steel in her soul. I spoke to her briefly in the powder room. She didn't care about the retreat or the Highlands. She wanted her settlement, and she told me quite plainly that if Marcus didn't come up with the final payment by the first of the year, she would ruin him. She knew where all the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. She seemed like the type who wouldn't mind making one of those bodies literal if the price was right. Hamish rubbed his chin, feeling the prickle of stubble. The social dynamics of the upper class were always a labyrinth of hidden debts and polished grudges. Sterling had been a man under siege from all sides, a village he had threatened, an ex-wife who wanted his blood, and a financial empire that was nothing more than a house of cards. The Taj, the ancient Highland shield, was the most interesting part. It was a symbol of resistance, a weapon of the old world used to crush a man of the new. Did he have any friends, Priscilla? Hamish asked. Anyone who wasn't trying to sue him or squeeze him for money, in this circle? Priscilla laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. Friends are just people you haven't betrayed yet. There was a man, a consultant he brought up from London named Julian Vane. A slippery sort. He's staying at the Drim Hotel now, I believe. He was the one handling the legal loopholes. If anyone knows the dirty details of Marcus' plans, it's him. But be careful, Hamish. These people don't play by the rules of Lochdubh. They have lawyers who cost more than your annual salary. Hamish tipped his cap, feeling the familiar weight of his position. He was the peasant policeman, the man they all underestimated. It was his greatest weapon. Och, I'm used to people who think they're smarter than me, Priscilla. It's a very crowded club. I'll go and have a word with this Mr. Vane. Maybe he can tell me why a man would go for a midnight swim in a shield. He turned to leave, but Priscilla reached out, touching his arm. The warmth of her hand through his coat made his heart skip a beat, a reaction he hated himself for. Hamish, she said softly. Blair is going to try and pin this on Fergus or someone else local. He's already telling everyone it was a drunken brawl. If you want to save the village from his heavy-handedness, you'll have to find the truth before he arrests the first person he sees with a Highland accent. I know, Hamish said, his voice hardening. Blair wants a quick arrest so he can go back to Strathclyde and claim a victory. I want the person who did it. There's a difference. As he walked away, Lugs trotting beside him, Hamish felt the cold wind cutting through his coat once more. He had a name now, Julian Vane, and a motive that smelled of bankruptcy and betrayal. But more than that, he had the image of Priscilla standing against the stone of the castle, a reminder of the life he could never have, and the peace he was willing to fight for. The investigation was no longer just a disruption of his holiday. It was a battle for the soul of Lochdubh. He needed to move quickly, before the Sassenach complications turned into a Highland tragedy that even he couldn't fix. The truth was hidden somewhere between the old land deeds and the cold, dark water of the wellness spring, and Hamish Macbeth was the only man who knew how to listen to the silence of the hills. He would find the killer, not for the credit or the promotion he so feared, but because the mountains deserved better than the likes of Marcus Sterling and the shadow he had cast over the end of the year. He trudged down the drive, his mind already miles away in the smoky rooms of the Drim Hotel, preparing his next mooch. Hamish Macbeth walked with the rhythmic, steady gait of a man who had spent his life traversing the hills, his mind clicking through the bits of gossip and facts he had gathered. The walk from Tommel Castle back toward the heart of Lochdubh was long, and the biting wind off the water was starting to find the gaps in his thick coat. The Highland air was heavy with the smell of wood smoke and the sharp salt tang of the sea, a combination that usually brought him comfort, but today felt like an oppressive weight. He was thinking of Julian Vane, the slick consultant Priscilla had mentioned, and the desperate financial straits of the late Marcus Sterling. But as he crested the final rise above the village, the high, piercing wail of a police siren shattered the morning stillness, echoing off the grey rock faces. Hamish picked up his pace, Lugs trotting with a renewed sense of urgency. By the time he reached the village square, a small, anxious crowd had gathered outside the police station. At the center of the commotion stood Detective Chief Inspector Blair, looking as triumphant as a Roman general returning from a successful campaign. Beside him, two officers held a struggling, red-faced Fergus McLean. Fergus was a giant of a man, his shoulders broad from years of hauling heavy lobster pots, but he looked small and defeated in the iron grip of the law. His sister, Morag, stood nearby, her face streaked with tears as she clutched a damp handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes darting between her brother and the stern policeman. "There he is, the village genius," Blair shouted, as soon as he spotted Hamish's tall, lanky figure. "While you were off having tea and crumpets with the local aristocracy, Macbeth, real policemen were doing real work. We've got him, red-handed, or rather, red-jacketed. It's a textbook arrest, really. Efficient, fast, and exactly what the public expects from a modern force. We found the evidence that links him directly to the crime scene. No thanks to your lazy loitering." Blair held up a plastic evidence bag with a flourish. Inside was a heavy brass button, slightly tarnished, with a distinctive anchor design. "Found this snagged on the jagged edge of the marble tile at the wellness pool, right where the Londoner went in. And would you look at that?" He pointed with a meaty finger to Fergus' heavy wool cardigan. The top button was missing, and the remaining ones were an exact match for the one in the bag. "I suppose you'll tell me it's a coincidence, Macbeth. A magical wandering button that just happened to fall off a murderer." "I didn't do it," Fergus roared, his voice thick with the desperation of a man who knew he was being framed. "I was at the bar. I told you, I didn't leave until after the bells had rung. I was drinking with the rest of them. Save it for the station in Strathclyde, you big oaf," Blair sneered, his face turning a deeper shade of purple. "You were seen arguing with Sterling yesterday afternoon. You didn't like him sniffing around your sister, and you didn't like him threatening the smithy. You followed him up the hill, had a row, and shoved him in. Simple, clean, effective. Anderson, getting in the car. We're heading back. I'll have a full confession out of him by sundown, once he realizes the game is up." Hamish looked at the button in the bag, and then at Fergus. He looked at the mud on Fergus' boots, a thick, dark peat mud, common enough in the Highlands, but fundamentally different from the gritty, grey clay that surrounded the new marble tiles of the wellness spring. He also noticed something else. Fergus' dog, a mangy terrier named Pip, was sitting by the station door, whimpering. Pip was never more than an inch from Fergus' side, a loyal shadow. "A fine piece of work, sir," Hamish said, his voice dripping with a feigned admiration that Blair was too arrogant to see as sarcasm. "A button. It's a very solid bit of evidence. Very solid indeed. It's a wonder he didn't notice it was missing before he came down the hill to celebrate. Criminals are stupid, Macbeth. That's why we catch them," Blair said, puffing out his chest. As the squad car roared away, leaving the villagers muttering in small groups, Hamish stayed behind. He knelt down next to Pip, scratching the dog behind its ears. "He didn't do it, did he, Pip? Because if Fergus had gone up to that pool, you would have gone with him. And if you had gone with him, you would have been covered in that grey clay. Your paws are as clean as a whistle, save for the usual peat." Hamish stood up and walked toward the hotel. He didn't believe in the button. He had seen that cardigan on Fergus for years. The buttons were sewn on with heavy-duty fishing line. You'd need a pair of sharp shears to get one off. The cardigan was perfectly intact, save for the missing button. It hadn't been pulled off in a fight, it had been cut. He entered the hotel bar, which was now empty save for Archie McLean, who was cleaning glasses with a funereal slowness. "They've taken him, Hamish," Archie said, his voice trembling. "Blair says he's a murderer. Tell me, Archie, did anyone come in here this morning after the body was found? Someone who wasn't a policeman?" He thought for a moment. Just that consultant fellow Vane. He came in looking for an espresso. He was hovering around the coat rack for a bit, waiting for his drink. He seemed very agitated. Hamish's eyes moved to the coat rack near the door. Fergus' cardigan had been hanging there last night when the search began. It had been left unattended for hours. The red herring was as clear as the loch. Someone had taken the button from the cardigan while it hung in the bar and planted it at the scene after the murder was committed. It was a clumsy attempt to frame a local, but there was one more thing. Hamish remembered the Taj. The shield was an awkward thing. To fix it around a man's neck would require a specific kind of knowledge. The mystery was deepening, and the hidden motive was beginning to surface. He walked through the biting cold toward the Drim Hotel, his heart heavy. The killer was someone who knew the village intimately enough to steal a button but was arrogant enough to think a Highland policeman wouldn't notice. The trap was beginning to take shape. The Drim Hotel sat perched on a wind-swept ridge like a brooding gargoyle, its grey stone walls glistening with the relentless sleet that had begun to fall again as the afternoon light failed. Inside, the atmosphere was one of stifled elegance and the pervasive, cloying scent of potpourri mixed with expensive cigar smoke. Hamish Macbeth parked his battered police Land Rover near a row of sleek, German-engineered sedans that looked entirely too clean for the rugged Highland terrain. He stepped out, lugs following with a disgruntled shake of his wet coat, and made his way toward the heavy oak doors. He wasn't here to make a formal arrest, not quite yet. She was here to mooch information, to occupy space in a way that made people feel the need to talk simply to fill the awkward vacuum of his presence. He knew that Julian Vane, the London consultant with the predatory smile, was currently sequestered in the sunroom, and Hamish intended to be the most inconvenient guest the man had ever encountered. The sunroom was a cage of glass and iron, offering a panoramic view of the loch that today looked like a sheet of hammered lead under a bruised sky. Julian Vane was seated in a high-backed rattan chair, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, held in a hand that was notably unsteady. He looked up as Hamish entered, his eyes narrowing behind his expensive designer frames. "Constable," he said, the word dripping with a manufactured politeness that didn't hide his deep irritation. "I assume you're here to tell me that the local constabulary has finally managed to secure the handcuffs on that giant who was terrorizing the hotel last night." DC Vice Blair was quite confident when he called me earlier this morning. Hamish didn't answer immediately. He took off his peaked cap, wiped a bead of moisture from the brim, and looked around for a place to sit. He chose a chair directly opposite Vane, settling into it with a series of slow, deliberate movements that seemed to stretch time itself. "Aye, Fergus is in the cells," Hamish said softly, his Highland lilt thickening for effect. "Blair is a man who likes his results fast, like a microwave dinner. But I've always found that the faster the meal, the more likely it is to give you a nasty case of indigestion later on. I was wondering, Mr. Vane, if you could help me with a small detail. A man like yourself, so well-versed in the intricate laws of property and finance, you must have had a very close working relationship with Mr. Marcus Sterling." Vane took a long, sharp sip of his drink. "I was his consultant, Macbeth. Nothing more. I managed the acquisitions and the legal framework for the Craigie Manor project. It was purely professional." "Purely professional," Hamish repeated, as if tasting the words for bitterness. "And yet, I heard a whisper that there was a bit of a disagreement. Something about a final payment and a bridge loan that never materialized. And then there's the matter of the ancient ruins. Mr. Sterling seemed very keen on those ruins. He thought they were the key to something quite special, didn't he?" Vane's grip on his crystal glass tightened. Marcus was an enthusiast. He liked the heritage angle. He thought the ruins would add value to the wellness brand. It was all marketing fluff and nonsense. Hamish leaned forward, his hazel eyes suddenly sharp, the facade of the lazy village copper slipping just enough to be dangerous. "See, that's where I'm confused, because I had a quick look at the old parish records on my way over. Those ruins aren't ancient, Mr. Vane. They were built in 1920 by a man who wanted to pretend his family had deep roots in the glen. They're a sham, a fraud, just like the deeds you were trying to use to evict the Pattersons. You knew that, didn't you? You weren't just helping him buy land, you were helping him steal it, using forged documents you created." Vane laughed, though it was a thin, brittle sound. "You're out of your depth, Constable. Land law is complex. You can't just read a dusty book and think you've solved a crime. Marcus was the one pushing the boundaries. I merely advised him on the possibilities." "And did you advise him on the weight of a 17th century Taj?" Hamish asked, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "It's a heavy thing, isn't it? Takes a good bit of strength to hold a man down in the water with one of those. You'd need to be standing right over him, wouldn't you? And the brass studs, they're quite sharp. I noticed you've got a bit of a plaster on your palm, Mr. Vane. Did you cut it on a letter opener, or was it the shield?" Vane pulled his hand back, tucking it into the pocket of his blazer, but the flinch was unmistakable. The silence in the sunroom became heavy, charged with the sudden realization that the useless peasant was anything but. Hamish watched him, letting the silence do the work. He knew the motive now. It wasn't just the embezzlement, though. Vane had certainly been draining the project's accounts. The real motive was far more biting. Marcus Sterling had found out about Vane's own fraudulent background, that he wasn't a London consultant at all, but a disgraced clerk from Edinburgh who had reinvented himself. Sterling wasn't just going to fire him, he was going to humiliate him in front of the local elite, including Priscilla's father, effectively ending Vane's social existence before it had truly begun. It's a terrible thing. The fear of being found out, Hamish said, stood up, and replaced his cap. It makes a man do desperate things. It makes him plant buttons on coats and drown his only ticket to the high life. You think Blair is the one you have to worry about, because he's loud. But it's the quiet ones you should watch, Mr. Vane. The ones who know the difference between peat mud and marble clay. Vane stared at him, his face a mask of pale fury. You have no proof, Macbeth, just a cut on a hand and a theory. Blair has a suspect in a cell with a missing button. Who do you think the fiscal will believe? Och, you're right about the proof, Hamish said, turning toward the door. That's why I'm going to have to find some. And in Lochdubh, proof has a funny way of floating to the surface when you least expect it. Enjoy your scotch, Mr. Vane. I'll be seeing you again very soon. And I would keep that hand covered if I were you. The Highland air is very bad for infections. Hamish walked out of the hotel, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and dread. He had the why, but he was a long way from an arrest. He needed a trap. He needed to make Vane move, to make him reveal the one piece of evidence that could save Fergus and send the Sassenach to the gallows. As he climbed back into his Land Rover, he looked at Lugs. We've got him, boy. Now we just have to make sure he mows it. The plan was already forming a rumour, a plant, and a bit of Highland theatre. He would use Vane's arrogance against him. A man who thinks he's the smartest person in the room is often the easiest to lead into a deep pit. The new year was starting with blood, but Hamish Macbeth was determined it would end with justice. The darkness at the wellness spring was absolute, a thick, velvet shroud that seemed to swallow even the faint, rhythmic pulse of the loch below. Hamish Macbeth stood perfectly still, his back pressed against the cold, damp stone of a decorative archway. He had been there for 3 hours, a duration that would have driven a more energetic man to distraction. But for Hamish, it was merely an extension of his natural state of repose. The only difference was that tonight, his lack of movement served a lethal purpose. The train had transitioned from a biting sleet into a steady, freezing downpour that soaked through his greatcoat and chilled him to the marrow. But he didn't stir. He was waiting for the greed and the fear he had planted in Julian Vane to bear fruit. He had spent the late afternoon spreading a very specific rumour through the village, that the police divers had been called back for the morning because a small metallic object, likely a signed signet ring, had been spotted in the silt of the pool by a passing local. It was a classic piece of Highland theatre. Hamish knew that Vane, a man whose entire existence was built on the shaky foundations of stolen identities and forged signatures, could not risk the possibility of leaving a physical link behind. Even if such a ring didn't exist, the mere suggestion of it was enough to act as a hook in the mouth of a desperate fish. As the distant clock in the Lochdubh kirk chimed 2 in the morning, the sound of a footfall reached Hamish's ears. It wasn't the confident stride of a man on a mission, but the hesitant, scraping sound of someone moving in shoes entirely unsuited for the slippery, mud-slicked paths of the estate. A beam of light, thin and frantic, began to dance across the surface of the pool, illuminating the dark water where Marcus Stirling had met his undignified end. Julian Vane stepped into the circle of light provided by his own torch, his expensive cashmere coat now ruined by the brambles and the wet. He looked smaller than he had in the hotel sunroom, stripped of his props and his audience. He was kneeling at the edge of the marble tiles, his fingers clawing at the grit and the freezing water, searching for a ghost of a ring that Hamish had invented out of thin air. The sight of it filled Hamish with a weary sort of sadness. So much effort, so much blood, all for the sake of a facade that was already crumbling. He stepped out from the shadows, his heavy boots making no sound on the wet grass. It's a bit late for a dip, Mr. Vane, Hamish said, his voice surprisingly loud in the stillness. And I doubt you'll find much in that mud but the truth, and that's a thing you've been running from for a very long time. Vane spun around, the torchlight swinging wildly before settling on Hamish's face. The man's eyes were wide, the pupils dilated with a cocktail of panic and exhaustion. You, Vane hissed, his voice cracking. I should have known you were lurking. You're like a parasite, Macbeth. A slow ginger parasite. He tried to stand, but his foot slipped on the very marble tile where the button had been planted, and he fell back onto his haunches. There is no ring, is there? You lied. A policeman lied to trap an innocent man. I'm not much of a policeman tonight, Hamish said, moving closer until he was only a few feet away. Just a neighbour of the people you tried to ruin. You killed Stirling because he found out you weren't the high-flying Londoner you claimed to be. You were the one who forged those deeds to the smithy, hoping to sell the land out from under the Pattersons, and split the profit before Sterling even realized what had happened. But he caught you, didn't he? He was going to turn you over to the very people you were trying to impress. So you used that targeta, bit of local colour, you thought would point the finger at a savage Highlander, and you held him down. It wasn't about the money in the end, was it? It was about the shame. Shane's face contorted, the mask finally shattering to reveal the jagged edges of a cornered predator. He was a fool. He was going to ruin everything over a few acres of dirt, and a sense of moral superiority he didn't even possess. I built that project. I deserved that life. With a sudden, desperate cry, Vane lunged forward. He wasn't a fighter, but he had the frantic, unpredictable strength of a man with nothing left to lose. He swung the heavy, industrial-sized torch at Hamish's head, the metal casing whistling through the air. Hamish, however, was not the slow-witted peasant the outsiders took him for. He had spent years hauling sheep up mountain tracks, and wrestling with unruly fishermen, his reflexes were honed by a life of physical necessity. He ducked the blow with a grace that would have surprised DC Vice Blair, and stepped into Vane's guard. He grabbed Vane's wrist with a hand like a vice, twisting it until the torch fell into the mud with a dull thud. Vane snarled and threw a clumsy punch that grazed Hamish's jaw, but the constable didn't flinch. Instead, Hamish used his weight to drive Vane backward, the two of them tumbling into the freezing, shallow water of the wellness spring. The struggle was messy and ungraceful, a tangle of limbs and wet wool in the dark. Vane clawed at Hamish's face, his nails drawing blood across the constable's cheek, but Hamish simply pinned the man's arms to the cold marble. He was heavier and stronger, his endurance far greater than that of a man who spent his days in air-conditioned offices. "Enough!" Hamish roared, his voice echoing off the manor walls. He flipped Vane over, pushing his face into the wet grass and wrenching his arms behind his back. Charles, who had been waiting in the bushes, emerged to bark a sharp, rhythmic approval of the arrest. Vane let out a long, shuddering sob, the fight draining out of him as the reality of the handcuffs which Hamish finally produced from his pocket clicked shut around his wrists. They were both covered in the grey clay of the construction site, soaked to the skin and shivering. Hamish hauled the man to his feet, his grip firm but no longer aggressive. "You'll have plenty of time to work on your narrative now, Mr. Vane," Hamish panted, wiping the blood from his cheek with his sleeve. "But I think the fiscal will find the story of a man caught searching for evidence at a murder scene far more compelling than anything you can invent." As he led the stumbling, broken consultant toward the idling Land Rover, Hamish felt a familiar sense of relief. The village was safe, Fergus would be freed, and the Sassenach nightmare was almost over. He just had to find a way to let Blair take the credit before the man arrived to start shouting again. It was the only way to ensure he stayed right where he belonged. In the quiet, rain-washed peace of Lochdubh, the heater in the Land Rover was making a sound like a bag of spoons being shaken by a very angry ghost, but it did little to alleviate the damp chill that had settled into Hamish's bones. Beside him, Julian Vane was a pathetic heap of sodden cashmere and shattered nerves, his breath hitching in the dark as they wound their way back down the treacherous path toward the Lochdubh police station. Lugs, sensing the tension, had squeezed himself into the footwell, his wet fur emitting a scent that was a pungent mix of swamp water and old wool. Hamish kept his eyes on the road, the wipers rhythmically slapping against the windshield, clearing away the freezing slush that threatened to blind them. He was not thinking about the arrest he had just made, or the blood still drying on his cheek. He was thinking about his career specifically, how to ensure it remained exactly where it was. In the world of the Strathclyde police, a successful arrest of a high-profile London consultant for the murder of a millionaire was the kind of thing that got a man noticed. It was the kind of thing that resulted in commendations, newspaper interviews, and, most terrifyingly of all, a promotion to a bustling city precinct. Hamish could already see the grey, suffocating walls of a Glasgow office, the endless hum of computers, and the lack of a decent fishing spot for miles. To save his life in Lochdubh, he had to lose the credit for the crime. It was a delicate dance he had performed many times before, a strategic retreat into the guise of the lucky, simple-minded village bobby who had merely stumbled upon a victory, crafted by his superiors. As the lights of the village appeared through the mist, Hamish saw that the station was still ablaze with activity. DC Farr's car was parked haphazardly across the pavement, its blue lights casting a rhythmic, accusing glow against the stone walls. Blair himself was visible through the window, pacing the floor, and likely rehearsing the speech he would give to the chief constable about the arrest of Fergus McLean. Hamish pulled the Land Rover to a halt, took a deep breath, and turned to the shivering man beside him. "Now, Mr. Vane," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a tone of conspiratorial softness. You've had a very long night. And DCI Blairwell, he's a man of very short temper. She's been out there in the cold, tracking your movements with a brilliance that even I found intimidating. He's the one who realized the button was too obvious, you see. He's the one who knew you'd return to the scene. Vane looked at him, his eyes glazed with exhaustion. Blair? But he called me an innocent bystander. A ruse, Hamish whispered, leaning in. A masterclass in psychological warfare. He wanted you to feel safe, so you'd lead him right to the evidence. If I were you, I'd tell him everything. He respects a man who knows when he's been outmatched by a superior mind. It might be the only way to avoid the harshest of sentences. Hamish climbed out of the car, hauled Vane to his feet, and marched him toward the station door. As they entered, the heat hit them like a physical blow. Blair stopped his pacing, his face turning an even deeper shade of plum as he took in the sight of the muddied constable and the cuffed consultant. Macbeth. What is the meaning of this? I told you to stay out of the way. Why have you brought Mr. Vane here in such a state? If you've harassed this man, I'll have your badge. Hamish adopted a look of wide-eyed, stammering confusion. He allowed his shoulders to slump and his cap to tilt at an unpolished angle.
Oh, sir!
I am so sorry, sir. I was just doing as you suggested, keeping an eye on the perimeter of your crime scene. And then, just like you predicted in your briefing, the one where you mentioned the suspect's psychological need to return to the water. There he was. It was just as you said, DCY's Blair. You said he'd crack under the pressure of your investigation, and he did. He ran right into me, shouting about how he couldn't stand the way you were closing in on him. Blair blinked, his mouth hanging open for a fraction of a second, as his ego grappled with the unexpected tribute. I said that, did I? You did, sir. You told Anderson and MacNab that the killer would be a man of high intelligence who thought he was smarter than the Strathbane force, but that you'd have him trapped by morning. I just happened to be the one standing in the dark when he panicked. He was so terrified of your profile of him that he tried to throw himself into the pool to find a ring he thought you had discovered. It was a brilliant trap you set, sir. Truly brilliant. Anderson and MacNab, standing in the corner, exchanged a look of profound disbelief. But Blair was already expanding his chest, his waistcoat buttons straining under the weight of his sudden borrowed glory. Well, Blair huffed, adjusting his tie and stepping toward the trembling Vane. I may have dropped a few hints to that effect. It's all about the pressure, Macbeth. You wouldn't understand the nuances of a high-level interrogation, but the groundwork I laid yesterday was designed for exactly this outcome. Vane, broken and desperate for any shred of leniency, looked at Blair. You knew. You knew about the deeds, about the embezzlement. Blair didn't skip a beat. Every penny, Vane. Every forged signature. I was just waiting for you to make your move. Now, sit down and tell us about the Taj. And don't leave out the part where you tried to frame the local lad. I found that particularly insulting to my intelligence. Hamish retreated into the background, melting into the shadows by the tea urn. He watched as Blair took over the room, shouting orders, and basking in the glow of a solved case. Shh. The DCI would go back to Strathbane a hero, the man who caught the Sassenach killer through sheer deductive brilliance. He would write the reports, take the bows, and most importantly, he would leave Hamish Macbeth alone in Lochdubh. You're a devious man, Hamish, a voice whispered from the doorway. Priscilla was standing there, having followed the sirens to the station. She looked at the scene. Blair blustering, Vane confessing, and Hamish quietly sipping a lukewarm cup of tea. I'm just a simple policeman, Priscilla, Hamish replied with a wink that only she could see. And it's a very lucky thing for me that DCY Blair is such a genius. It saves me an awful lot of paperwork. As the sun began to rise over the snowy peaks of the Highlands, casting a pink glow over the quiet waters of the Loch, Hamish felt the tension of the year finally dissipate. Fergus was being released, the killer was in custody, and the piece of Lochdubh, though battered, remained intact. He had lost the credit, but he had kept his home. For Hamish Macbeth, there was no greater victory than that. He turned to Lugs, who was already eyeing a stray biscuit on the desk. Come on, boy, let's go home. I think there's a pot of stew with our names on it. The sun had finally managed to pull itself above the jagged ridges of the mountains, casting a pale, watery light over the village of Lochdubh. It was a light that didn't so much illuminate as it did reveal the exhaustion of the night. The blue lights were gone, the sirens had faded into the distance, and the heavy, aggressive presence of the Strathbane police had evaporated like the morning mist. DCI Blair had departed with Julian Vane, in the back of his car, looking for all the world like a man who had personally wrestled a dragon to the ground, rather than one who had simply walked into a room where the work was already done. Hamish Macbeth stood on the pier, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, watching the last of the exhaust fumes vanish around the bend of the road. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of silence that only exists in the Highlands after the world had tried to be loud and failed. Beside him, Lugs gave a long, rattling sigh and sat down on his haunches, his gaze fixed on a seagull that was poking suspiciously at a bit of discarded fish. The dog looked as weary as his master, his patchy fur still damp from the nocturnal excursion to the wellness spring. Hamish felt a strange sense of emptiness, a hollow feeling that always accompanied the end of a case. It wasn't regret for the man who had died, nor was it a longing for the excitement to continue. It was simply the weight of the secrets he now carried, the knowledge that the peace of his village was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the greed of men who didn't understand the rhythm of the tides or the patience of the hills. He turned away from the water and began the slow trudge back toward the police station. As he passed the Lochdubh hotel, he saw Archie McLean outside, vigorously sweeping the steps as if trying to erase the very memory of Marcus Sterling's Bentley. Archie looked up and gave a short, sharp nod. In the Highlands, a nod like that was worth 1,000 speeches of gratitude. It meant that Fergus was home, that the smithy was safe, and that the village knew exactly who had ensured that the new year would not be spent in the shadow of a wrongful arrest. There would be no public celebration, no medals, and certainly no mention of Hamish's role in the local paper. That was exactly how he wanted it. If the world thought he was a useless, lazy copper, the world would leave him be. And that was a prize far more valuable than any promotion Blair could ever dream of. Inside the police station, the air was cold and smelled faintly of the damp clay he in vain had tracked in. Hamish set about his true work, the work of returning his small universe to its proper order. He poked the embers in the coal stove until they glowed a defiant orange, then added a fresh shovelful of coal. He filled the heavy kettle and set it on the hob, the sound of the water beginning to simmer, acting as a soothing balm to his frayed nerves. He took off his greatcoat, which was now a disaster of mud and bramble tears, and hung it by the heat. He would have to find a way to explain the damage to the quartermaster in Strathclyde, likely a story involving a particularly aggressive sheep and a very steep ravine. Blair wouldn't care. Blair was currently busy drafting a press release that featured the word brilliant at least 6 times. As the kettle began to whistle, a soft knock came at the door. Hamish didn't have to look to know who it was. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe entered, bringing with her the scent of expensive soap and the crispness of the winter air. She looked around the small, cluttered kitchen, her eyes lingering on the muddy boots by the door and the exhausted dog on the rug. "I thought you might be hiding," she said, her voice gentle. She didn't stay by the door but came further into the room, leaning against the wooden table. "My father is still in a state, of course. She's found out that the wellness retreat land is now tied up in a legal nightmare that will last for decades. He's quite annoyed that he won't be getting his partnership after all. I'm sure he'll find another way to make a pound, Priscilla," Hamish said, reaching for the tin of coffee. "Your father has a very resilient heart when it comes to finance. Would you like a mug? It's not the fancy stuff they serve at the manor, but it'll take the chill out of your bones." "I would love one," she replied. She watched him move the slow, deliberate way he measured the grounds, the steady hand as he poured the boiling water. "You did a good thing, Hamish. Fergus told me what you said to him before they let him out. He knows. They all know. They know I'm a man who likes his peace and quiet," Hamish said, handing her a thick ceramic mug. "And they know that if they don't keep my name out of the official records, I might actually have to start doing some real work. That's a threat that keeps most folk in Lochdubh very quiet indeed." Priscilla smiled, a real smile this time, one that made Hamish feel a momentary pang of what might have been. But then he looked out the window at the grey loch and the circling gulls, and he knew that he belonged here in the cold and the rain. He sat in his chair as the sun set. The Highlands were quiet. Lugs slept. The stove glowed. Hamish smiled. He was home, safe from progress, safe from cities, and safe from the noisy, ambitious world that never truly understood the Highlands. The following morning, the silver Bentley Bentayga was finally hoisted onto the back of a recovery truck, looking remarkably like a high-tech coffin for the New Year's ambitions. The village of Lochdubh watched the departure with a collective sense of grim satisfaction, their faces pressed against the frosted windows of the post office and the general store. The spaceship had landed, caused its chaos, and was now being dragged back to the world of glass towers and predatory balance sheets where it belonged. For the people of the Glen, The departure of the car was the true end of the Hogmanay drama, a signal that the mountains had once again chewed up an intruder and spat the remains back across the border. Hamish Macbeth stood on the harbour wall, his hands tucked into his sleeves against a wind that felt as though it had been sharpened on an iceberg. He watched the truck disappear over the rise, the silver paint flashing one last time in the weak winter sun before the grey landscape swallowed it whole. Luggs sat at his feet, shivering in a way that suggested he was deeply offended by the lack of a proper breakfast. Hamish looked down at the dog and sighed, a long, misty plume of breath escaping into the air. Aye, Luggs, the circus has left town, and not a moment too soon for my liking. Any more excitement, and I would have had to start wearing a tie to work. He turned and began the walk back toward the village centre, his pace unhurried, the very picture of a man with nothing on his mind but the next cup of coffee. But as he passed the Patterson's smithy, he noticed a small, folded envelope tucked into the iron grate of the door. He didn't pick it up, he knew what it was. It was the missing land deed he had found in Julian Vane's hotel room, while the man was busy being interrogated by a jubilant DC Fast Blair. Proved, beyond any legal doubt, that the smithy and the surrounding ruins belonged to the village trust, a document Vane had intended to burn. Now, it would be discovered by the Pattersons, and the wellness retreat would remain nothing more than a bad dream. In the post office, Mrs. Wellington was holding court, her voice carrying over the shelves of tinned peas and woolen socks. A stroke of luck, that's what it was, she was saying to a nodding Mrs. Gillespie. DCY Blair, for all his shouting, has a mind like a steel trap. To think he knew about that Londoner's forged documents all along. It makes you feel quite safe, doesn't it? Knowing we have such brilliant men in Strathclyde. Hamish entered the shop, the bell chiming a cheerful greeting that seemed to mock the dark events of the previous nights. He moved to the back to check his mail, his expression one of polite, slightly vacant interest. He didn't correct Mrs. Wellington. If the village wanted to believe in the myth of Blair's brilliance, it only made his own life easier. The less they expected of their local constable, the more time he had to enjoy the silence of the hills. He bought a small packet of biscuits for Luggs and a tin of tobacco, nodding vaguely as the ladies discussed the heroism of the city police. As he stepped back out into the cold, he encountered Priscilla one last time before she was due to head south for a week of social engagements. She was looking particularly radiant in a cream-coloured wool coat, her car idling nearby. "I'm leaving for Edinburgh, Hamish," she said, her eyes searching his face for something he was not quite ready to give. "My father is still grumbling about the lost investment, but I think he's secretly relieved he doesn't have to deal with Gloria Sterling. She's already filed for a massive insurance payout on Marcus's life, you know. She didn't waste a single tear." Hamish nodded, his gaze drifting toward the loch. "Some people don't have tears to waste, Priscilla. They're too busy counting the cost of the water. I hope you have a fine time in the city. It'll be a lot louder than Lochdubh, I imagine." She reached out, her gloved hand resting briefly on his arm. "You're a strange man, Hamish Macbeth. You solve the world's problems and then hide in a kitchen with a dog. Don't you ever want more than this?" "I have the mountains, Priscilla," he said softly, his Highland accent becoming a gentle melody in the wind. "And I have the peace of knowing that when the sun goes down tonight, there'll be no more strangers in green tweed trying to move the stones of the glen. That's more than enough for a man like me." He watched her drive away, a small part of him wishing he could follow, but the larger part, the part that belonged to the peat and the heather, feeling a profound sense of relief. He was a creature of the Highlands, a man who understood that the only way to truly survive in a place so beautiful and so harsh was to move slowly and listen to the things that were said. The Sassenach had failed because they had tried to impose their own frantic tempo on a landscape that measured time in centuries. He had succeeded because he was willing to wait for the truth to drift to the surface, like a piece of sunken timber. By evening, the police station was warm and smelling of the rich, onion-heavy stew that had been simmering on the stove for hours. Hamish sat in his armchair, a plate of food on his lap, and a copy of the Strathclyde Gazette open on his knees. The headline was a bold black scream: "Blair cracks Hogmanay horror." Below it was a photograph of the DCY looking stern and victorious, standing next to a map of Lochdubh. Hamish chuckled, a low, dry sound that made Luggs lift his head from his paws. "He's a handsome devil, isn't he, boy? And he's welcome to every word of it." He folded the paper and tossed it into the recycling bin. The case was closed, the credit was misplaced, and the promotion that had threatened to tear him away from his beloved Lochdubh was now a distant, vanishing shadow. He was still just PC Hamish Macbeth, the lazy policeman of a quiet village, and there was no higher honor he could imagine. The wind continued to howl outside, rattling the window pane and singing in the chimney. But inside, the fire was steady and the coffee was hot. Hamish leaned back, closing his eyes, the dark humor of the mystery finally fading into the background of his mind. He had protected his people, he had saved his own career by appearing to fail it. And he had ensured that the new year would begin, as every other year had, with the quiet, enduring rhythm of the Highlands. As he drifted toward a well-earned sleep, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock and the content, rhythmic snoring of the dog. Lochdubh was at peace once more, and for the man who kept its secrets, that was the only resolution that truly mattered. The year ahead would undoubtedly bring more trouble, more outsiders, and more paperwork. But for tonight, Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he was meant to be. He reached out, turned off the lamp, and let the shadows of the glen wrap around him like a familiar, protective cloak. The mystery was over, the trap had worked, and the Highlands remained, as always, undefeated by the ambitions of men.